Hello again, class. So we're doing part 3 of our chapter 4 tissues. This will be the final part. And so now our chapter 4 has 3 parts to it. The first one is a review of things we talked about, so it's not as much detail. It was also done in the evening when I was a little tired. But nonetheless, the next part 2 I just posted, and now we have part 3 to finish it off. So part 3 begins with slide number 118, and it begins with muscle tissue. And again, we have a chapter on skeletal muscle. You're also going to have a chapter on the heart, cardiac muscle. In this chapter, you also have a little bit on smooth muscle. Okay, the 3 different types of muscle tissue. But mainly in this part of the course, we're looking mostly at skeletal muscle and its discussion in detail in some chapters that follow this. So muscle tissue is the 3rd type of connective tissue that exists. It's the 3rd type of tissue. Connective tissue was the one we did last. My apologies. Muscle tissue, and then we'll finish with nervous tissue. Okay? So what can we tell you about muscle? No matter which type it is, skeletal, cardiac, smooth, they all have one common trait, and that is they all can contract. Contract means the cell can change its shape, enlarge, shrink, and when it contracts, it creates movement. Movement for skeletal muscle would be movement of your joints and your bones, right? Movement for cardiac muscle would be the heart pumping blood. Movement for smooth muscle would be movement of food through the digestive system, movement of blood through the blood vessels, and so on. All right, smooth muscle makes up most of our hollow organs and blood vessels in the body. Cardiac muscle makes up the heart, and skeletal muscle is what we find on our bones, on our bony skeleton. All right, so they talk about that in slide number 118. Okay, then they go through some details about skeletal, and they compare it to cardiac and smooth. So what comparison can we make? So on 119, they're telling you that skeletal muscle cells are long, thin, tube-like shaped cells, and we call them muscle fibers. So we don't say muscle cell, we say muscle fiber. Clarity. Fiber was just used in our last videos to describe protein fibers. So that's a protein fiber found within a connective tissue, sometimes found within a cell. Here we're talking about the word fiber, meaning the entire cell. So muscle fiber is used to describe muscle cell. They're synonymous. They tell you that these do not divide once they're made. They're somewhat permanent, and then also once they're destroyed, there's not mitosis available to make new ones. If you need to make new ones, all right, there is a sequence using a stem cell, a myosatellite cell. And we'll talk about that again in the skeletal muscle chapter in more detail, but they mention it here on the slide. The myosatellite cell is a stem cell that can undergo mitosis and make or repair muscle fibers. Again, the word fiber meaning cell. They also mention the word striated. They also mention the word voluntary. They also mention the word multinucleated. Multinucleated means multiple nuclei. It's unusual for a cell to have multiple nuclei. Skeletal muscle cells do. We'll see a bone cell that does, something called an osteoclast, but most cells have a single nucleus. They talk about the word voluntary. That means you decide when you want to contract and move the muscle. It's under your voluntary, conscious control, as compared to the other two, which are not. Right? They're involuntary. Striated means that the proteins within the cell, and we typically refer to it as actin and myosin. It's really thin filament, thick filament, but the proteins within the cell are arranged in a parallel and organized way, creating overlapping protein fibers, creating what we call striations, which we see when viewing the cell under the microscope. So it's something that you see in light microscopy, but it just indicates that there's an orderly arrangement of proteins within the cell. Cardiac is striated, skeletal is striated, smooth is not, which means there is not that organized overlap of thin and thick filaments. So they describe some of the components of skeletal muscle, and they're comparing them to cardiac and smooth. Again, we have the beautiful picture boxes of skeletal. Then they talk a little bit about cardiac. And here they say striated involuntary. They don't mention anything about autorhythmicity. They say regulated by pacemaker cells. We'll talk in detail about autorhythmicity and pacemaker cells in the cardiac muscle chapter. And then a little bit on smooth muscle. Can divide, can regenerate. That's a big difference, unlike the other two. They say non-striated, involuntary muscle. A picture box of cardiac muscle tissue and smooth muscle tissue. In the smooth muscle tissue picture box, you can see long tapered cells, no striations, single nucleus. I'm going to go back to slide 122. In the cardiac muscle cell, a cardiac muscle tissue picture box, you can see striations, single nucleus, and the cells are branched. They're not long, slender tubes, but they actually have a little branching pattern. And the cells are connected tightly to one another by something called the intercalated disc, which is at the end of each cell. And there's not much on muscle tissue. They finish with the fourth tissue type, nervous tissue. And once again, we have a chapter on nervous tissue. So we're going to do that in detail in the chapters to come. But here's an introduction. So nervous tissue is made up of cells. There are two major types of cells. There is what's known as the neuron, which we've discussed, sensory neurons, motor neurons. Neurons are the cells that actually transmit. So a neuron is like a live wire that's able to transmit information from, say, here, point A, to here, point B, throughout the body. Sensory neurons bring information to the brain. Motor neurons bring information from the brain to other parts of the body, what we refer to as effectors. So that's the functional cell. And then there's something called neuroglial cells, or neuroglia. And those are the support cells, meaning they do not transmit data. They take care of and support the neurons. And in the nervous system, in the nervous tissue, you have about 50% neuron, 50% neuroglia that make up the system. Put the cells together, you create nervous tissue. And what do you use nervous tissue for? To make your brain, to make your spinal cord, and to make all the peripheral nerves of the body. All right? So they give you basic parts of a neuron. And when we were looking at cells way back when, different types of cells, we pulled out a neuron and we looked at the neuron and we said that there's a distinct cell body. If my hand is a cell body, there were then dendrites sticking off of it. And if my arm then represents the axon, there's an axon sticking off of the cell body. We looked at these basic components, and that's what slide 125 says. There's a cell body where all the organelles and the nucleus is found. There are little dendrites extending off of the cell body. They receive information. That's where the cell receives information. And then there's a long axon that transmits the information. They don't talk about the end of the axon. We may have in lab class, but the end of the axon, so if again my arm is the axon, at the very, very end there are little branches called telodendria. And you have a slide of a neuron. We looked at that in lab. They give you a little picture box of neuroglia. They're not telling you much. They're just telling you that they're support cells and they do all kinds of support functions. Nourish the neuron, protect the neuron, repair the neuron, hold the neuron in place, and so on and so forth. Okay, they give you a picture on 128 of a basic multipolar neuron. And you can see the dendrite, cell body, axon, and at the very end of the axon, the telodendria. So the last part of this video is going to be a discussion of tissue injury and repair. Now, we did this together in class the other day. I told you that it comes at the end of the chapter, but we were talking about different cell types, so we did it at that point. But I think it's worth discussing one more time as a review, because tissue injury and repair is the foundation of healing, right? A lot of our healthcare centers around injuries that occur to our tissues, whether it be from a trauma, a tear, a puncture, a cut, a twist, a pull, any one of those kind of physical things, or infections, deterioration of tissue, so on and so forth. The body has the ability to repair tissue and cells when they become damaged. Now, of course, we said different tissues, different extent of repair, right? Some cells and some tissues do not repair very well. I mean, repair, meaning getting rid of the dead tissue and replacing with something else, happens for all tissues. Repair, what we refer to as regeneration, meaning taking the dead cells and replacing them with a similar new functional cell, again, depends from tissue to tissue. We know that our skin and the cells of our skin repair, regenerate very well. We damage them, we remove the dead ones, and we replace them with new functional skin cells. Our brain tissue, nervous tissue, some of our muscle tissue does not repair, meaning regenerate, very well at all. When we damage those cells, yes, the body does remove the damaged dead cells. It does replace what was there, but typically it's replaced with a scar tissue, meaning a lot of collagen, a lot of fibrous tissue, not the original functional tissue that we had before the injury. So we want to go through these steps, and slide 129 and the slides that follow go through that information. So it says tissue injury and repair. Tissues respond to injuries in 2 stages. So first is the acute inflammation, the inflammatory response, and then second is the regeneration, the repair or regeneration of the tissue. So think of it. There's damage. The dead cells, the damaged cells, any toxins, any bacteria that enter the injury site have to be removed. And we refer to those cells as our garbage men. These are our macrophages and our microphages that come to the area, take away all the garbage, clean it, and now the cells that remain, that surround that area, the living, healthy cells that remain, can now undergo the processes necessary to either regenerate, make new cells via mitosis, and replace what was lost with new functional cells, or fibroblasts producing copious amounts of collagen or scar tissue and filling that empty space with scar tissue. Again, depending on the tissue type. Skin versus muscle versus nervous. And so we went through a series of steps, and I'm looking at the slides 130, and they're telling you how the injury begins, either trauma or infection or both, and that there are damaged cells in the area, and those damaged cells, membranes have been torn open, release chemicals from the cell, right? They say proteins, they say ions. They also say something known as the prostaglandin. And the prostaglandins are the chemical messengers, the chemical mediators that are so important in this acute inflammatory processes. They direct, this process and allow it to occur. And again, acute inflammation is a good thing. It's a healthy thing. It's a required thing. All right? So the damaged cells leaking out prostaglandins, ions, and their contents will activate, right? Because I drew a picture on the board where we had living within our tissue, right? Something known as a mast cell, type of white blood cell. Living within our tissue, we have fixed tissue macrophages, and they're there waiting just in case something happens, like this. Those damaged cells leaking out prostaglandins, leaking out their contents, trigger or activate the mast cells that live in the neighborhood. And the mast cell now kind of becomes the firehouse, becomes the siren, meaning it is going to release histamine and heparin and chemicals that will now accelerate the inflammatory process. So that's what slide 130 says. It moves on to now the mast cell releasing its chemicals, creating the process of inflammation. Now, what does it say on this side? They are bringing in things like necrosis and pus and an abscess. They're talking about now that there is all kinds of things going on in the area. They've kind of jumped a little bit ahead of where I want to be. So let's move to the actual pictures on 133. All right. So they have a picture of a boy scraped his knee. They're saying exposure to pathogens, toxins, and damage to the tissue. The damaged cells release their ions, their proteins, their prostaglandins, and then the arrow points to mast cell activation. Mast cells produce histamine and heparin. Next slide. Mast cell activation at the top of 134 says the release of heparin, histamine, and more prostaglandins produce acute inflammation. And they give you the characteristics of acute inflammation. It says increased blood flow. That's because these chemicals produced by the mast cell produce a vasodilation, increased blood flow to the area. Why do we want increased blood flow? Because we want the plasma part to leak out and build up water and flush out the area. We also want to deliver white blood cells to the area that can now leave the blood vessel, come into the damaged area, and help with the cleanup and repair of the tissue. So we're going to deliver neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, monocytes to the damaged area. So increased blood flow due to increased vasodilation of the vessel. Next one says increased vessel permeability, meaning that the ability of the plasma and the things within the blood increases, meaning the ability for that stuff to leave the vessel and enter the tissue space increases. So increased permeability means the vessels become more permeable. They allow fluid and cells to leave the blood and enter the tissue space, the interstitial fluid, as we have talked about it, right? They also mention pain. So pain is the release of these chemicals and prostaglandins and toxins, irritating sensory nerve endings in the area, indicating something is wrong within the body. You feel pain, right? So increased blood flow, increased permeability, the movement of things from the blood into the tissue space causes some swelling, causes some redness, causes the area to become a little warm, heat, and pain. Those are the characteristics of acute inflammation. And remember, acute inflammation is a good thing, a short-lived inflammatory response to clean the debris and remove the garbage, so to speak, from the area, so that we now have a clean space that we can now rebuild the tissue. All right, slide 135 continues with inflammation, saying what I just said. Those three things lead to temperature and increased oxygen and the presence of more cells and the removal of all the toxins and waste, right? So temperature goes up, the area becomes warm, the area becomes red, the area becomes swollen. Because there's more blood, we have more oxygen available, more cells available, more nutrients available. Because the cells are brought to the area, we have more phagocytes, cells that can undergo phagocytosis, removing the debris, removal of the toxins, waste, and cleaning it up. all right? Big role of macrophages and microphages. All right? So we can skip back. I'm going to go back to 131 because here they're talking about pus. And pus is all these cells that have come to the area, removing dead tissue, removing toxins, all that dead cell and dead tissue that develops in the area is known as pus. And they mention abscess, where there's a huge accumulation of pus. The pus is not being broken down and removed by the lymphatics, by the cells at a rapid rate, and it's beginning to build up in an area causing a large abscess. The presence of an abscess is not necessarily a good thing. Okay, they mention the word necrosis. Necrosis means dead tissue cells, right? That's how it all began. 132, the following, is what we've already said, but it kind of finishes what we're saying. The ability to regenerate tissue, to replace the cells that are damaged with new functional cells, depends on the tissue type, right? They say epithelial and connective tissue, except cartilage, smooth muscle, regenerate well. Skeletal, cardiac, nervous, regenerate poorly, if at all. Damaged cardiac muscle cells are replaced by fibrous tissue. And again, that leads us to the point of scarring. If you cannot put functional cells back, normal functional cells, the area of damage will be filled with scar tissue, meaning fibrous, protein-dense tissue, which is different than the original tissue, right? It's not the original tissue. It's called scarring. We move to the very end. Slide 136 talks about aging and the tissues of your body. And as we've said, with aging, you see every slide on aging basically says what? Things aren't working as well as they did, right? The aging process is not necessarily a positive one, right? As far as body function goes, right? Slow repair processes, the ability to maintain tissue is diminished, the loss of collagen and its elasticity and strength. These are the things that happen. Tissues just begin to weaken, break down over time. It's a normal part of aging. The ability to repair them slows, and so on and so forth. Okay? So here on 137, they tell you effects of aging. All right? I'm not going to read them to you. You could read them easily yourself, right? They throw in a little bit about cancer at the end. We're not going to talk much about cancer at this point, but obviously it's quite prevalent in our society. There are many toxins. They mention chemical exposure, cigarette smoking as big causative factors, as you know. From a tissue and cell perspective, you know, what is cancer? Cancer is when a normal cell of the body has a genetic change to it, and the cell now doesn't function normally, but functions as a rogue or cancer cell. Meaning, instead of producing the things it typically does and maintaining body function, its sole purpose becomes to undergo rapid mitosis and make more cells, right? So this rapid mitosis and the manufacturing of big clusters of cells creates what we call a tumor formation, right? So cancer has to do with our cells, has to do with our tissues, and has to do with genetic changes that take place in our normal cells that lead to these abnormal cells and abnormal growth of cells. And I think we'll leave it there. I don't think there are any other slides that follow. I think I'm at the last one, 138. So now you have 3 parts to the video to review Chapter 4. The next video that I will make, we'll move on to Chapter 5, and it'll be available to you on YouTube.